Okay, hello everyone. I guess we'll get started here. Thank you for joining the 7th Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice webinar today. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I am the facilitator of the online Climate Change Adaptation Community of Practice, which is run by OPR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So the way the webinar will run is as follows. After this very short introduction, we'll have the main presentation, which will go for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then at the tail end of the webinar, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for any questions that you might have for Chris. Before we start though, I just want to mention that for those of you who dialed into the conference line, your lines have been automatically muted. So if you'd like to ask a question during the discussion period at the end of the webinar, all you'll have to do is just dial *6 to unmute your line, but I'll mention that again later on. And as well, we will be recording the webinar and I'll send it out to the registered participants sometime today or tomorrow, the recording, and we'll also post it to the FACoP website. So you'll notice that we're running the webinar using Adobe Connect. There's a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen there. If you have any technical difficulties or problems during the webinar, just use this chat area to type your message and I will try to help out as best as I can. And as well, for those of you who are listening in through your computers, you can use this chat box to field any questions that you might have for Chris during the question and answer period, and then I can just read them out loud for everyone. So I know we have some people on the line today who may not be familiar with what the community of practice is, or the COP as we call it. So quickly before we start, I just want to mention that the COP is an interactive online community that provides a space where researchers, experts, and practitioners can come together to communicate with others who are working in the field of climate change adaptation. And the COP currently hosts over 470 members, including provincial and territorial employees, individuals from other levels of government, academia, the nonprofit sector, and the private sector. And the FACoP is actually located within this larger community of practice. So it's basically a site within a site. And it's dedicated to those members working in the forestry field or who are interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada. And it provides a space where members can share information and best practices on current activities in the area of climate change vulnerability and adaptation assessment in Canada's forest sector. And it's free to join, so if there's anyone on the line who's interested in learning more about the FACoP, please just contact me for more information, and you can find my email address in the chat box on the left there. So with that being said, on the line today we have Dr. Chris Swanston, who has generously donated his time to present this webinar for us today on the Climate Change Response Framework, which is a collaborative cross-boundary approach among scientists, managers, and landowners to incorporate climate change considerations into forest management. And his presentation will review the common structure and approach of the Eco-Regional Response Framework projects, major products and milestones, and lessons learned. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenter, Chris is a research ecologist at the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station and is the director of the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. His main professional interests are in climate change adaptation and ecosystem carbon cycling. Chris has been the project lead for the Climate Change Response Framework project since the pilot began in 2009. He also serves as co-chair of the Climate Change Resource Center, chair of the Science Steering Committee of the National Soil Carbon Network, and a member of the Science Steering Committee of the North American Carbon Program. So with that introduction, I will now turn things over to Chris, and thanks again for being here today. It's very much appreciated, and the floor is now yours.
Thanks very much, Annette, and thanks to both you and Jason for inviting me to give this presentation. I also want to call first attention to my four co-authors, Leslie Brandt, Patricia Butler, Stephen Handler, and Maria Genoviak. These are the four climate change coordinators, response framework coordinators that I'll be talking about in a moment. So I'm going to try to get through the first half of this talk pretty quickly. That's just a description of the framework and its products, and try to spend a bit more time on the lessons that we've learned while trying to put this thing into motion. And so, as the title implies, there's the flashy first part, translating climate science into action. That sounds great, And of course, we all know the reality of trying to get something done. So really, I'd like to discuss with all of you the lessons that we've learned while trying to translate anything into action. Okay. Oops, sorry, I have to get used to this system here. All right. So the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, just to give you first an idea of who we are a multi-institutional partnership. We consist of 3 branches of the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, that is research, management through the eastern region. They do the national forests, and then northeastern area, which helps state and private forestry throughout the 20 state upper Midwest and Northeast. We also have non-Forest Service partners such as Michigan Tech University, the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement, which is an industry-funded science body, and the Trust for Public Land. We have about 11 staff members, 5 or 6 full-time focus on climate change and essentially bridging a gap between academic climate change discussions and information and the needs that land managers have in terms of having that information delivered to them in a usable format. So I'll talk a bit about the climate change response framework, certainly in the first part of this talk. And essentially what it is it's an approach by scientists, managers, and landowners to find climate-smart ways of integrating climate change considerations into conservation management. And climate-smart is one of those sort of schmarmy, focus group terms that I really resisted at first, but have grown to like quite a bit, in part because it's so vague, actually. And first of all, nobody really wants to be climate dumb, and that's a first good part. The second is that in being ill-defined, I think there's a lot of strength in terms of a lot of different management goals can be met, or a single management goal can be met by different activities. But even a same ecosystem may have many different management goals depending on ownership or other considerations. So there's lots of ways to be climate smart and to sustain healthy forests moving into the future. So we don't press or push any single agendas or ideas as much as we do try to find a diversity of ideas, see how they'll work. Okay, the climate change response framework started actually early in 2009 in northern Wisconsin. And let's see if I can get this going here. All right, there we go. Northern Wisconsin in the Swanston National Forest as a pilot. And once we sort of looked at some of the ways that we could go about doing things, developed some of our techniques, built some of the initial partnerships, we later expanded it to the rest of the Northwoods in Michigan and Minnesota. The Northwoods was then specifically Province 212 within those 3 states. And that was in 2010. In 2011, we moved down into the central Hardwoods and started a new framework in these areas, again, by ecological province. And then finally, in 2012, this year, we have begun a 3rd climate change response framework project in these 3 states. So we have, as I was said earlier, 4 full-time coordinators, and they have a full-time support person to help them with maps, data, issues, and other things. And they work with over 45 partner groups that span these 3 partnerships. Pretty much wherever we work, we try to figure out who's there and what they're up to, what kinds of state, local, even federal initiatives are happening, and to see how we can essentially become value added to people who are already working in these places, as well as achieving our own goals. We work with the national forests as core partners, but also critically, we work with anybody on any land ownership. And the fundamental concept here is that climate change is an issue which spans ownership, spans boundaries, spans management goals. And so we try to work with all comers who are interested in working with us. Essentially, this is a 6-step process. The first is just to figure out where you are, but then once you figure out where you're going to be working, you really need to look at who is there, who's working there, what they're doing. That's both scientifically and in terms of who's managing the land and what they're managing it. That's really an iterative process as well, certainly at first, although partnerships continue to be established throughout this process. That's one thing we found. Once you establish an analysis area, you begin to assess vulnerabilities within that analysis area and also work with scientists and managers in that area to compile relevant adaptation strategies and approaches. And I'll talk more about those and how we delineate these concepts. And finally, then, work with land managers and landowners to both plan and implement adaptation actions at appropriate scales. The 6th step, in terms of integrating monitoring and evaluating effectiveness, obviously that's a much longer-term step. It's arguably one of the most important steps, but it's one of those things that we'll have to see how it works over time. We do our best to integrate monitoring into the plan. As we all know, in an adaptive management approach, monitoring is both the most important but also often the weakest component. So essentially what this is really is a process of engagement, assessment, and management. It delivers 4 key products, and I'm going to talk in the next half of this talk, I'm going to talk more about each one of these products: partnerships, assessment, adaptation resource, demonstration project. So first, the partnerships. Fundamentally, they're designed to foster dialogue. And a lot of the time, we manage to bring people to the table who normally wouldn't be talking to each other amicably, but realize that this is an issue that again, transcends a lot of other issues, and that we're all really figuring it out as we go. So there are partnerships to be built where normally partnerships wouldn't easily exist. Another reason to bring people together is to get a better informed notion of what the science needs are, what kind of monitoring infrastructure is already there and can be drawn upon, as well as needs to be created, somehow funded, and also what kinds of science exists in terms of information in a given area and how it can be applied. In terms of the vulnerability assessment, what we're looking at in the assessments we do primarily are forest ecosystems. And these assessments are vegetation-centric, and I apologize for the formatting on this slide. It seems to have gone a bit awry. So the primary focus is ecosystems. We have 5 of these assessments underway. So what they basically look at in about 7 chapters are what's there in the contemporary landscape and provide some information on who uses it, how they use it, and how it got to be the way it is now. There's a climate change primer that comes at the reader from the angle that we don't expect the reader to know everything about climate change and how it is projected and how it is measured in terms of past time. So we provide some of that information in the primer. We also have a chapter on what observed climate change is for the assessment area, and that's from Met Station data going back as far as we can find it. And then also projections of future climate change. One critical thing that we do is we provide a range of plausible climate futures. So we use different combinations of general circulation models and emission scenarios to give people an idea, really a visual idea, based upon showing them different maps of what plausible climate futures might look like, and ask for them to essentially deal with that range that we've provided them. And when in the next chapter we talk about impacts on forests, again we use that range and providing information on projected forest impacts across that whole range. And a fundamental concept in this is that the sort of certainty that we are working with a stable baseline around which there's variation is really a thing of the past. And what we're dealing with now is a bit of a new reality in which we have a range of possible and plausible climate futures. And as we're thinking about forest management, we have to begin thinking about how the forests we manage can cope with the entire range. And to the extent that they are unable to cope with the entire range, we need to begin thinking about the risks that we incur over the parts of the range that these forests will not be able to cope with or may not be able to cope with, and how much of that risk we're willing to incur. Finally, in the sixth and seventh chapters, there is we try to give clear statements of forest ecosystem vulnerabilities, and then with some implications for forest management. These assessments are written for land managers. They're not written for scientists. They're also typically a bit more complex than a lot of the general public would be comfortable with. They're written for most often a college-educated professional. A fundamental part of these assessments also is drawing in a large group of people to provide us with their judgment and experience. We work with multiple modeling groups, and each of these assessments includes more than one model to model the same area to give us different structural, in terms of model structure, different perspectives on projections. But we also work with individual scientists to bring them in terms of panels and put them through a formalized elicitation process in which we have them consider those chapters that I just showed you. Consider the contemporary landscape, the past climate, projections for future climate and vegetation impacts, and then essentially rate the ecosystems on their level of vulnerability and the agreement within the group and between the data sources or information sources. And based upon that information, we largely make our vulnerability determination. But the ultimate vulnerability determination is made by the authors of the assessment. So essentially what we're doing here is we're not ceding our judgment to models. We are using models to inform the judgment that we make as land managers and scientists. These panels also include both land managers, practicing land managers, as well as scientists and modelers. In terms of the climate change adaptation resources, one thing that we've done is compile a menu of strategies and approaches for climate change adaptation that people who have different management goals can choose from. So we're not telling them that there is one way to do things and they should go about doing things that way, but rather trying to provide a range of these approaches that can meet a range of different kinds of management goals and objectives. We also provide a workbook process to help those those approaches be applied in a logical way to meet objectives, help people formally not only consider climate change, but provide documentation of those considerations, which for some organizations is really quite important to be able to show that documentation. Critically, we as a group don't ever make recommendations to the managers. We understand that our role is to bring information to managers. It is to also help them integrate that information to their decision-making processes, but it's not our role to make recommendations. They are the professionals who are also responsible for the decisions that they make. So we very explicitly stay out of those decisions. In terms of that concept of strategy and approach, one thing to consider is that a lot of what you see in the academic literature is this, these options of resilience, resistance, and transition or response. And you hear a lot of talk about strategy, but there's really, often anyway, there's no distinction between timing, between spatial scale, between the level or the continuum of policy to actual on-the-ground action. One thing that we've tried to do in our organization of ideas of how to work on the land for adaptation to climate is to separate these ideas into options, strategies, approaches, and tactics. And so as you move through that continuum, you move from a much more conceptual approach to a much more action-based approach. In the final orientation of tactics, these aren't something that we provide. This is something that with the manager we work, that the manager actually decides upon and devises in consultation with us. So the strategies and approaches that we provide are, there are about 10 strategies, 39 approaches. These have gone through dozens of reviews and been vetted by local experts as well as national experts. In terms of the workbook process, this is really a classic adaptive management process that is adapted to climate change. Essentially, the first step, and I think the most important step, is to consider the management goals and objectives. And that's really the starting and the ending point. With those in mind, you can consider the broad trends of climate, both past and projected climate, and then think about how those broad trends may play out at the local scale. And then begin to reevaluate the objectives, the original management objectives, see if they're still viable, and what kinds of adaptation strategies and approaches may be taken to ultimately achieve those objectives. And then devise ways of actually, again, carrying those out on the ground. So again, it really needs to be flexible to accommodate any number of management objectives as well as adaptation approaches. And it always comes back to trying to meet the needs of the land manager and landowner. The demonstrations are really our attempt to show how this may work on the ground. And in part, there's a background idea that we're just continuing to try to promote dialogue between different kinds of ownerships and management oriented organizations. But really also what we're trying to do is show how this might play out when it happens in actual land management activities. And we have several organizations that work with us, including the Swanston National Forest, again, where we started in northern Wisconsin. And these specific organizations listed here are in northern Wisconsin, where again, the pilot started. And so these are some of the first to actually essentially dedicate land to this idea and say that they will work on their land using these products and these methods to actually implement adaptation strategies and approaches. So the Swanston National Forest is one, Bad River Tribe is another, and the Niche Conservancy, which I'll talk about in a minute, is another. And we're also working, of course, with the Wisconsin DNR and Minnesota Forest Resources. In terms of the Nature Conservancy work, they have about 1,000 acres in northern Wisconsin, and they essentially have intended to manage those for mid to late successional forests, mimicking natural disturbances and trying to emphasize underrepresented species, such as hemlock, say, and yellow birch. Now, we know there are climate change challenges there, such as warmer temperatures and altered precipitation regime, timing, type, drier summers, and also many of the northern species that are typical of this area are projected to decline. That's true really throughout the Northwoods. So the first thing is to consider what they're already doing in terms of their current management that may have adaptation benefits. And so, of course, favoring the underrepresented species allows opportunities to favor some of the future adapted species to the extent that some of those underrepresented species may be future adapted. They want to encourage large woody debris, and in fact, that may create moisture and cooler conditions on the forest floor that may help regeneration. And regeneration is really one of the first places you see some of these northern species begin to die out, even as the more mature individuals aren't doing so bad. And finally, in mimicking natural disturbances, it's a fundamental premise of their management orientation it helps them more easily take advantage of the natural disturbances that may occur more frequently with climate change. So one thing to do when we're thinking about these adaptation actions, think about them with a ski slope analogy in terms of easiest, more difficult, most difficult, and finally expert with the double black diamond. Some of the easiest things to do, again, are things that folks at trying to maintain refugia on certain parts of that landscape that may better be able to in those cases something as honestly politically difficult as climate change adaptation, but even just conceptually and scientifically and actual management activities, difficult as it is. And again, because of all those difficulties, trust itself is critical, and a lot of that has to do with just showing up. What I have there about a smile being more effective than an emoticon. You can get a lot done with a handshake over dinner, over beer, that you just can't ever get done over email or a phone call or even a video con. And so a lot of it is about showing up and showing the person that you're serious. If you're asking a landowner or a land manager to try something new, to head in a different direction, potentially to step out and do something a little bit differently than his or her peers are doing, being willing to actually go to them to see their land and hear about their needs is absolutely critical, and it really does make all the difference. If they're going to step out on a limb for you, they're going to need to trust you. In terms of getting things done also, one critical concept delivered to us once in this perfect phrase by a colorful individual is you can't steer a bicycle unless so big projects like the ones that we're driving can very easily get bogged down, especially as they're first starting and you're in the planning phases. Everybody has a different idea, and nobody's certain who has which responsibilities, or perhaps you have somebody who has some responsibilities, but they're not following. So it's really critical, I think, to identify a project coordinator who will be the center of everything. And that partly gets back to what I was just talking about above, in terms of it's people who do the work, the relationships matter. These are the people who spend the time on the phone, spend the time going to places, listening to partners and their needs, and then ultimately forging the agreement. And one of those key agreements is to decide where you work and what the boundaries are, and then forge forward with that. Now, as you bring in more partners, perhaps those boundaries will change a little bit, and that's happened to us. But ultimately, it's always been for the better. So there is need for, I think, some refinement as you move forward. One thing to remember is that your collaborators will bring lots of skills and resources. They'll bring more support in all sorts of ways to projects. But as you bring in more collaboration, as we all know, it just takes more time. And the more people you're working with, the more time it takes. That really forces you to make some decisions about who's doing what and when, who needs to be on which calls, and how to balance all that with people feeling left out of decision making, and also that their voices may not be heard. So I'll come back to the idea again then that really it's the people that matter and it's the personalities that matter, because trust is essential in this whole business. So this picture that I just popped up here, these are several of our coordinators and support. And these are, very nice people. They get things done. They're very effective. They're great professionals, but they provide individuals who others can go to and have these conversations. Sometimes just to blow off steam, and again, that makes all the difference. And being coordinators, you'll notice that they like to coordinate things like height in group photos, which I thought was pretty hilarious. But I just do it on. Okay, social lessons. One thing is critical. One thing that is most critical is communication. And one thing that we've learned early on was that these different disciplines that we're working with, even within land management, a silviculturist, a hydrologist, they'll use different terms than will scientists who are presumably within the same discipline, and they use yet different terms than perhaps we will. And some of those terms can be real triggers to the others, and you think you're using something that means one thing, and it means entirely something different to the person you're talking to. It's really important to keep circling back around to what you mean when you say X or Y, and define specific terms with the groups that you're working with. It saves the time that you invest in that. Ultimately saves a lot more time in the long run, especially as you begin writing things down and creating documents. There are trigger words that will provide a lot of heartburn to some communities that other communities may be completely unaware of. So those are really explicit questions that can be asked of different partners, whether they're managers asking scientists or vice versa. It's important to make those things clear. I alluded to the multiple levels of communication earlier, in that especially if you've got a project where you might have 20 or 30 or 40 people involved, not everybody can be in on every call or every meeting, nor would that be even remotely efficient. So really you need to think about who needs to be doing what and when, but also who needs to hear about certain things when, and then how they need to hear about things. And that gets back to the use of language, and that the kind of information you share, and when you share it, is something to really think about and do in a way that is both practical and efficient, but also thoughtful, honestly, and considerate in terms of people that you're working with. We hear a lot about stories, and I found this to be true again and again, that you can provide all the evidence that you want, and one just absolutely slam dunk of a table or graph after another, and leave a room full of non-scientists completely unconvinced. But then you tell them a story that takes place in a place that they know and is about something that they know, perhaps told by somebody they trust, and that makes suddenly all the difference, and it places all of those graphs and all of the science in a context that they can understand, and they will often approach it much more, much differently, and in a much more positive light as well. Another concept in terms of social lessons is to focus the conversation. So one thing that we found early on was that we get a lot of resistance from some groups of people who were thinking that we were trying to solve climate change and the adaptation action that we were talking about, or that we were trying to get them to give up their management goals in order to pursue a carbon management agenda or mitigation agenda. One thing that I found to be effective in many groups that we work with, not all, and again, the message changes from group to group, and this is part of being thoughtful. One thing that I found effective with many groups is just to take the whole political discussion off the table. If this group isn't interested distinctly in mitigation, one thing to do is to distinguish between what we do to climate as a society and then what climate does to us and the ecosystems that we manage. And certainly acknowledge that climate is changing, that humans have an impact upon that change, and that the extent to which society deals with that impact is an enormous political discussion that is of great importance. But that isn't always the discussion that needs to be had at a given place and at a given time. Most often the discussion with land managers is the discussion about the impact that the atmosphere is going to have or may have on ecosystems that we manage, and how we might have to deal with that in one way or another. And as we talk about that, being very explicit about what we mean by uncertainty has proven quite helpful. When I don't define that word in a way that makes sense to people and spend some time on it, I find that when I talk about uncertainty, a lot of the time that is perceived as being me or scientists as being uncertain about climate change, whether it's happening, when in fact I may be trying to talk about the fact of climate change and really the uncertainty about the extent or severity of climate change in the future. There are inherent uncertainties that have to do with the emissions and the effect that emissions have on the climate, in the sense that these emissions haven't happened yet, so we don't know how much effect they'll have. There's another uncertainty in terms of how sensitive the climate is to these emissions. In both cases, this gives us a range again of plausible climate futures, and so most times that sort of dealing with that range of climate futures is a sort of a sledgehammer approach to uncertainty, but tends to be more effective in terms of just dealing with the concept and then moving on. Another part of moving on is just demystifying climate change. It's a great place to start in a conversation. You bring it up, people know generally what you're talking about, but beyond that, it's kind of vague and nebulous. It's a little bit even overbound and sometimes hard to conceive of. When you start breaking it down for folks, and you're talking then about more precipitation perhaps in the spring, less in the late summer. Perhaps it's hotter and drier in the late summer. You're talking about perhaps more snowpack in some places, but less than others. And you start essentially breaking it down into concepts that are very clear and have very clear management implications. That changes the discussion immeasurably. And at that point, you find that people who perhaps, I have found rather, that people perhaps are somewhat resistant, somewhat concerned that this is just an added burden on their already burdened work lives. They just grab onto this as professionals, as creative people, and they begin just working with it and thinking about how they'll adapt to something that's not even terribly specific that they've been given, but is a clear idea, a much clearer idea than just nebulous climate change. And finally, linking to a place is critical. As they think about the places that they manage, they'll often know those places much better than anybody else. And so when you give them some ideas about these plausible futures and how they may affect that place, they can take the very next step and say, yeah, well, maybe not. This place is more protected. It's less protected. It has a spring. It's in a valley. It's on a ridgetop. They'll often immediately begin adapting broad trends that are provided to them to the place where they work. And that's absolutely critical to achieve the next step of actual adaptation action. Okay, assessment lessons. I had bullets going all the way down this slide, and then a colleague looked at it, made me take out most. Even then, I'm not going to go through all of these. She made me just think. I focus on just three, so I'll just pick my favorite three. The first is ask managers what they need. The difference between creating a doorstop and something that people will actually use is starting out with asking your users what it is that they need in a document that you want to create. The second, down there towards the bottom, is to use multiple models to inform the process. And I again alluded to this earlier. The models in our assessment inform the process. They don't take the place of judgment and reasoning by professional scientists. And we use multiple models because really every model has detractors and proponents. They have different strengths and weaknesses. Some work completely differently than others. But by using multiple models, we can get essentially different versions of reality. And by looking at where they come up with similar results and a different result, we can gain insights into vulnerabilities or strengths, resilience, and the ecosystems we're considering. And then the panels. I think that these panels are critical to placing models and other information that perhaps a smaller group of people brought together, putting all of that through a larger group of people with diverse expertise who are going to be looking at it through fresh eyes, with fresh perspectives, with their own agendas and their own biases, and really work with them to hammer out a group consensus about potential vulnerabilities in specific. It's a powerful way to go about things, and ultimately, when a document is published with that as its basis, it I think has much more grounding and veracity. Okay, adaptation lessons. So when we're thinking about adaptation through land management, the first thing that I would say is that just as with any current management, there is no perfect prescription. And this gets back to this concept of climate smart. There's multiple ways to be climate smart. So the flip side of that is there is no perfect adaptation action that will be perfect everywhere for everyone. So really we need to begin again with those goals and objectives, and then think about the broad trends across a region, which is really all we're given in climate projection, and then begin to think about how those may play out at the spatial level that managers work at. Also, the idea of using these strategies and these approaches of adaptation and linking them to the actual actions that we'll be taking on the ground I think that it helps us define success. And I've heard people say, well, we're going to do X, Y, and Z on the ground. Clearly, that's what we'll need to do, given what you just told me about the coming climate. But how will we know if we're successful? Well, any given action can lead to multiple things over time. But if you have defined what your action is in terms of how it tiers to an approach and how that tiers to a broader strategy, whether that strategy has more to do with biodiversity or whether it has more to do even just with less diversity but greater health or growth rates, ultimately you can have a much clearer idea of what success is. And if you're not the one answering this question in 20 or 25 or 30 years, having written it down can be greatly helpful to the next person to come along. Okay, in terms of actual implementation, and this is partly the last bullet of the previous one as well, acknowledging constraints. A lot of constraints, there are already many constraints in the system. It just already takes a long time to get things done on the ground. And if you begin integrating climate consideration into the entire process, right now that's just taking even a little bit longer. That's just some of the reality that we're dealing with. So one of the things that we're focusing on in many places and that many people are more comfortable with is focusing on near-term, no regrets choices in order to provide a greater range of future choices. And in that, the system might not actually, the managed land might not actually look different to somebody just walking through it. But the reasons for doing things and the trajectories that they set in place could be very different over time. So finally, in terms of next steps, we'll continue feasibility assessments, continue expanding the strategies and approaches. We're always streamlining the workbook. It's just a big pain. Everybody tells us that. We know it. But it's got its strengths too. And then we'll launch new framework projects probably in the Northeast in the next couple of years and continue with demonstration. So in terms of lessons, well, your guess is as good as mine, but as with all lessons, they always seem really to learn. Okay. Thanks very much for listening. I apologize for going on and on well past my time that I intended to. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. Great presentation. So I guess we have 10 minutes, so we'll move right into questions. So if you're on the phone with us, just hit *6 to unmute your line. And if you're listening through the Adobe program, just use the chat box to type your question and I'll read it out loud for you. So is there anybody that would like to ask a question and start off the discussion period?
Hello there, it's Tim Williamson here. Chris, great presentation, Chris, and I think you're obviously really leading on the forefront of these assessment approaches. And lots that we can take from this, I think, in terms of our own approaches. So thanks very much for that. And but I did have a question for you about this issue of focus, I guess. And at least what it appears to me is that you've taken a vulnerability approach and applied it at a kind of an ecosystem scale. And then, of course, there's always this question of, what happens after the ecosystem and whether or not there's any, value or utility of getting into other kinds of impacts, like, for example, on the timber supply or biodiversity or any of these other kinds of values or things that we might draw from the forest that will be dependent, I guess, on the ecosystem impact. And then also kind of considering the adaptive capacity of the human part of the management system. So I'd just be curious as to your perspective of, the necessity of doing that, or whether that's kind of complementary, or whether or not what you've done kind of goes far enough in terms of sort of really coming up with the kind of the core sets of adaptations that are required.
Thanks, Tim. I don't think we've gone far enough. I think we've gone as far as we can, given our expertise and our funding. And what I have pushed for is for folks to work with folks, join with folks who can join a lot of the ecosystem and ecosystem management centric work that we do with the the rest of the supply chain, I should say. And we have actually funded. Took us a couple of years to find somebody who would do this, but we've been wanting to fund essentially an economic vulnerability assessment based upon ecosystem vulnerabilities. What are potential bottlenecks? What are potential vulnerabilities in the supply chain, going from based upon where things are expected to be vulnerable, and which species are, and then of course who uses them, and for what. And then that's really, that assessment is something that we can bring to county boards, for example. And there's a lot of, in some states in the United States, a lot of counties that actively manage for revenue. So that's the sort of thing that they'll be much more likely to listen to an economic assessment based upon an ecosystem assessment than just the ecosystem assessment. So I think it's really important to do what you've said. We don't have the capacity in my group, but I would love to work with groups to do it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Any other questions? Please just pipe in. No other questions? No questions online? No questions on the phone?
If there's no other questions, this is Barry Cook at the Northern Forestry Center. I wouldn't mind asking one, but anyone else, please jump in. Chris, excellent presentation. Thank you. You made two comments that I'd like you to follow up on. The first was about northern forest, northern hardwood decline, and how the regeneration stage appears to be a vulnerable stage, whereas mature trees often the symptoms are hidden, or they'll hang in there for quite a while. So I was wondering if you could be a little more specific about what species and what signs of evidence you see of regeneration failures. But that's tied to a bigger question about your other comment about monitoring and assessing the success of an adaptation scheme, how that being the most important, but often the weakest aspect in terms of the whole adaptive management cycle. So I'm wondering, in your experience and in your organization, in your sphere, what do you do for impact monitoring and monitoring the effectiveness of these different adaptation schemes? I'm sorry the question's so long. I can repeat it if that's required.
I think I got it, but feel free to jump in if I start wandering. Those are a big question. Let's see. There are more papers coming out, even just in the last few years, that are beginning to consider the response of all ecosystems, but especially I think northern ecosystems, to changes in climate over the last 50 years. I think Chris Woodall would be a name to search on. This is one of those times where I get asked a specific question, and immediately all my specifics jump out of my head. But a lot of what they've been finding using a lot of forest inventory and analysis data that has been collected by our FIA group over time is that even though there isn't significant dieback in the overstory, what they're beginning to see is a decrease in the regeneration of species that are identified as being likely to decrease from different models. And so, that is a bit of a response. People are saying, well, geez, you're saying all these species are going to die, but we're not seeing it. But in fact, the idea is it's not so much mature, established trees are going to die. It's just that the succession will happen because their regeneration will be as effective over time. Let's see. Some of those species are things like white spruce, balsam fir, red pine, jack pine, paper birch are some that the modeling shows would potentially decline. Hemlock, eastern hemlock, anyway. I'm forgetting. Did I mention yellow birch? So several of those species have been identified by models based upon sort of niche models as potentially declining, and now they're beginning to see that in and your other question was about monitoring and what we're doing. That really depends on the ownership and what they're able, willing, and mandated to pay for. And so that's different across public land and certainly in private land. And so there, and then in each state it's different depending on state laws. And so there may be near-term, most often there are near-term harvest regeneration guidelines or laws that people have to abide by. But in the long term, there generally aren't mandates of what you have to measure. And so really it's, when we're talking about doing these demonstrations, we're trying to set up with landowners the idea that, at least in many cases, we'll be able to come back and do some monitoring for them to see if some of these ideas have panned out. But really the larger issue of monitoring is being discussed at a national level in the United States. And it's recognized that we need to bring technology to bear in terms of remote sensing and use our forest inventory and analysis much more effectively and really attack this more creative way using existing infrastructure as much as we can because it's so expensive. So I hope I addressed your question somewhat.
Yeah, you listed a few species, and you suggested that the national monitoring and assessment would be critical or useful at least. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any final questions here before we wrap things up? Please just pipe in over the phone or type the question in. Give a couple seconds for maybe somebody will jump in.
Also, please, anybody feel free to contact me at any time. I'm happy to chat with folks.
Perfect. Okay. Well, if there aren't any further questions, I'll just say thanks everyone for joining the FACoP webinar today. We hope you enjoyed it, and a very big thank you goes out to you, Chris, for your time and effort and great presentation. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks.